It's my pleasure to welcome to the Today's Leader podcast, Building Tomorrow's Best Leaders Today. Please welcome Adam Williams. How are you, Adam?
I'm very good. Thanks, Tony.
It's great. I've been talking about having you on the podcast now for a while because there's so much to unpack in for what you've done within the business world. So first up, let's hear a little bit about the Adam Williams story.
Yeah, well, I'm a Wangipuran man. So my traditional heritage lines come from Scrubby Creek through Cobar and Wiradjuri country. Grew up in Western Sydney, so, did it the hard way, as they say, in Blacktown in Western Sydney. But my business career really took off through the pharmaceutical space, through Heron Pharmaceuticals and Sanofi, which is a big change from a qualified PE teacher into pharmaceutical. But it did seem to work.
Yeah.
So I'm a big believer in the theory. If you can manage kids on an oval, you can, manage a pharmacist and tell them what to do.
Nice way to think about it. So so you're the CEO of Supply Oz. You're also the chairman of the Murray Chamber. So let's have a chat about Supply Oz first. How did Supply Oz come about?
Supply Oz came about off me being privileged enough to attend a Murray business course at Melbourne Business School, which is an intense block training to establish the next lot of Indigenous entrepreneurs and business leaders. I met a group of some fantastic people, but four of us genuinely clicked in Sean Andrews, Dion DeVow and Jolene Hicks. And we decided we had to do something together. We admittedly had no idea what that together was going to be at the time, but we realised we had to do something. And whatever we did had to have a profound impact back into the community. We wanted to probably walk the path less trodden and start to deliver some initiatives that people could follow behind us, hopefully, and sort of break down some of the barriers to make it easier. And the PPE workwear space, office supply space seemed like the natural go for us. We had combined some experience in there. We had a lot of corporate contacts we could call on. And that was sort of where it all sort of kicked off, playing around in that.
So where is Supply Oz now? What sort of level of business are you at, and what are you aspiring to be?
We have a major goal. Our big audacious goal on the wall is to be the first Indigenous business listed on the stock exchange.
Wow.
So that's the next level of journey for us as a business. And I think one of the things we will have to do is change the platform and the definition of an Indigenous business so we can gain the level of investment we need to be able to take the business there.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the immediate hurdles we have right now.
So before we jump into that, because that's quite a compelling, I'd love to make a comment on that. But before we do, so Supply Oz supplies, a range of products. And I know that you're really proud of some of those Indigenous products that you do take to market. So just talk us through some of those.
I think the more immediate parts for us in that space, Tony, to put a clarity on what we do is we basically will sell we'll find whatever you need. We'll go and get it and search it for you. And the profit we make out of that helps us fund the sort of cool initiatives we want to do on the other side.
Yep.
So I think one of the biggest parts for us was partnerships with Trademark on our conversation starter shirts to give them their first sort of go at Indigenous artwork in that environment. Yeah. We decided to bring in our own masks, branded for what was immediate for now. And we're even ventured now into our own range of work boots under the bungee range. So we can spread so that the product can be irreversible as long as the process is right. Yeah. And then probably our biggest win to date has been the Diwa coffee, which is now ranged in Woolworths.
Yeah, and that's a great story in it itself, isn't it? So when you talk about giving back to the community, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of actions and behaviours?
I think it's a varied approach from straight out sort of cash initiatives and assistance to services, to being a visual point to talk to kids or the community, to liaise our way through, to show them that there are different avenues. We all don't have to work in a warehouse. We all aren't truck drivers and taxi drivers, that we can be executives. It's okay to be an accountant. It's okay to be a lawyer and that sort of thing as well.
I'm hearing a dog in the background.
Someone's coming home at my house. 1 second.
All right. So, yep, you're right. All right. So Adam, I would describe you as a role model for business in general. And I would have no qualms in, me and you have had many conversations around business. I've noted people along my journey that I've said, you need to go have a chat to Adam at Supply Oz. And that's from a general business sense. But within your community, you are a very clear role model as an Indigenous entrepreneur. So with that in mind, tell me about the work or the resurrection of what the Murray Chamber of Commerce. You're the chairman there. Obviously, you've got some really clear aims of what you want to see within the Indigenous business space. So tell me about what's happening with the Murray Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, I think the Chamber of Commerce is a collection of Queensland-based Indigenous businesses that probably all shared the same frustration that we just weren't getting our share of voice involved in, whether it was policy or decision making, or there was just a real generalistic approach of what we deliver to the industry here, that we're tourism, or we're here for welcome to countries, or we're here for a bit of artwork. And I think what the collection that we have together and what we wanted to try and change was that we're much more than that as an industry group, that we are shopkeepers and business owners. There's foods and cafes, there's accountants, there's concreters, there's carpenters, there's electricians in the mix, that we are quite a diverse business group. And then collectively, how do we let government know about that? How do we let the wider audience know about that? And then on a second line down, how do we encourage more of our Indigenous businesses to get involved in their local Chamber of Commerce as well?
Yeah, and become part of the overall business community. There's a very valid role for any business, any local business, to play within their local Chamber of Commerce, and especially true for Indigenous businesses. So where did the perception, you mentioned the perception there about the creative industries predominantly, and a lot of people would have that as a first point of contact when they're thinking about Indigenous businesses. They're thinking about artwork, they're thinking about tourism, they're thinking about cultural tours. So has that largely been driven within the Indigenous space, or has that largely been driven from, maybe government messaging?
I think basically it gets driven because it's an easy place to start. It's a low capex. One thing that Indigenous business struggles with is raising capital to get a business off the ground.
Yeah.
And I think it's just an easier avenue where people can dip into their culture, things that we're brought up to know, things that we're brought up and shown, that it's something that as an individual you hold that inside yourself. So to portray that out and get people to pay for that is an easy way to start the sort of revenue cycle, really.
Okay. So how would you describe at the moment the current Indigenous business space? What sort of descriptive words would you put to that?
I think it's a very juvenile space. I think the data is extremely manipulated by joint ventures.
Okay.
I think the data needs to be stripped out and cleaned to get a real picture of what the impacts are, what the damage is, and what the direction is.
So when you say joint ventures,
so where an Indigenous business and non-Indigenous business sort of come together to build it up. So mainly in the construction space, because that's where a lot of the big tickets are. And I think the numbers out of construction really throw what the Indigenous business segment's worth. I think it throws those numbers out by a lot, especially if it's a joint venture with a lend lease and an Indigenous partner. The whole value gets taken in. How much of that goes back to community, we can argue about all day.
Yeah. So within the government policies, or the well-intentions around government policies and whatnot, what's working currently, do you see, and what I suppose also needs to happen?
I think there definitely needs to be a lot more education around the process, especially government tender processes. I think they're complicated. They're usually well indoctrined to the previous tender holder.
Yeah.
And I think they really are designed for the bigger business partners to win. I know particularly in our space, they are quite difficult to crack because in a PPE space, they tend to lump everything together.
Yeah.
So they're really narrowed it down to 3 or 4 players to be able to be quite successful in them. So I think step one for a government should be the ability to split those tenders.
Yeah.
I think there should be also an ability to go to Indigenous business segment first to see if that tender can be split before it becomes an open tender process. I know governments have been fantastic at bringing terms back, so payment terms, because, as I said, raising that capital and having access to hold big amounts of stock is not a real possibility for most Indigenous businesses. But I think the ability to have that, and I think local councils can do a lot better as well, and maybe having a percentage set aside rather than a target we'd like to hit.
Yeah.
I would like to see it a mandatory, 3% even would be a nice start.
Yeah.
That of all tenders issued at a local government and state government level be given to genuine Indigenous businesses.
So I would consider that a lot of the policies that have come out of government are well-intentioned, but may not be necessarily getting the right result. Is that something that you would say as well?
Yeah, for sure.
So from an education of business space, what are some of the areas that, role models like you can help support or want to support in relation to that building up the foundation of the Indigenous business space?
I think the first point of call from our own space is we shouldn't be scared of our own competition.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we look at shadows a little bit and, he's making coffee, well, I'm making coffee now. I think that competition should be encouraged versus seen to sort of become a stumbling block to getting things going. Yeah. And I also think from a wider sense, there just needs to be a greater level of trust, trust that just because we're an Indigenous business doesn't mean we're not as good as anybody else. It doesn't mean the product's not going to break or it's going to be delivered a day late. All that stuff still happens. That's just normal trading.
Yeah.
And I think once we get that level of trust there, that we don't have to come and say, hey, we're an Indigenous business, can you give us work? It's just we're a business, and is our price good enough? Isn't our service good enough? I think that's the ultimate goal for me, that we can hear that discussion a little more.
Yeah, and it's certainly indicative of suppliers that you are rapidly, if you're not already in that space, you're rapidly getting to that space because you do have a history of delivering, and you shared the story with me when there was sanitizer required by one of our major retailers very early in the piece of the COVID pandemic, and you shared with me the story of the lengths that you went to get that particular contract. So I would imagine that where you are within a business world is where ultimately we'd love to see, the juvenile nature of where the Indigenous business space is and all starting to get into that particular space. Are they given the right advice, do you think?
No, a definite no. I think there's a cookie cutter approach to, let's whack 12 of these that filled out a form in the room and let's turn them into entrepreneurs. And I think there needs to be a lot more of an emphasis put back on some of those training circles to be a little bit real with people too, that your idea is just a nice idea, but it's not a good business. Yeah. You're going to need a job.
Yeah.
If you're going to survive with this as your concept, you need to work.
Yeah.
So this is something you do on a Sunday or online, but you still need a job. And I think that reality check doesn't get told often enough. And then these guys will go out into the marketplace thinking their business is going to fly, and they might end up with a real flash website and a lovely stand and a brochure, and then 6 months later they've made no revenue. And the impact back on family groups is massive for that. When, if they're given the right advice at the start that this is a hobby that may germinate into a business, but you're still going to need a job.
Yeah.
I think some of that honesty needs to happen on day one as well.
And we see that in every sort of business space. I get presented with so many ideas from people, and one of the first things that I really like to do now is to cost out that idea and the implementation strategy. So recently I started working with a lady who had this fantastic idea about, vertical gardens and having a cafe beside them. But once we actually costed it out and understood the level of investment that was required to do that, fantastic business idea, but the capability wasn't there. The absolute capability wasn't there. So she quite naturally said, this isn't for me. It's not going to work. And so she started looking at joint ventures and other people that were already in the space, so at least she could live and work with the purpose that she had. So, so fundamentally, what I see, I see that in every space where people grab an idea and say, let's turn that into a business. But you know, one of the Indigenous consultants that I did some work with was a lady called Emma, and she spoke to me once at a workshop, and she talked about it's one thing to find the gap in the market. It's another altogether to find market in the gap. And that's one thing that continues to stick with me and stay with me due to the fact that that is such a relevant concept. People will say there's a gap in the market. I'm going to create a business and I'm going to target that gap. But if there's no market in the gap, you're just wasting your time. You're wasting your resources and you're wasting your money. So if you were in charge, if you had the magic wand, and I know you don't like talking hairy fairy tale sort of stuff, you're very much grounded in reality, but if you had the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, what are some of those basic steps that you would be putting in to help build the foundation for Indigenous businesses?
I think to start with, I would make business courses free and senior level business courses as well, MBAs and EMBAs as well. I think education is the key from a business segment, which probably flows into the rest of it as well. I think once we can break down that barrier throughout education, I think we're going to see the genuine and true entrepreneurs, which there are a lot of them in the Indigenous space and some really good ones, have that, I suppose, that formality and the education to the hustle that they have, and they'll really sort of take the segment on way further. After I'm finished with it, I'll look back with amazement, I think, at where the next generation will take it. Yeah,
and I think that legacy is always something that's very motivational for each and every one of us, isn't it? That we're just playing our role in the particular time. So from a frustration point of view, and I promise this will be my last question on the Indigenous business space, what are some of the frustrations that you see from, you talked about, the Lend-Lease of the world partnering with, an Indigenous business, and then, we're getting an overstatement of the revenue or some questions on the validity of that money going back into community. Is there frustrations within that process, or is there any suggested improvements within that process that you could think of?
Yeah, I think there's huge improvements in the process. There's plenty of frustrations where, especially in the mining space, PPE and IT are probably the worst two that come to mind as a category where, they'll pop a black fella at the front and say, here's our new CEO, and our ASIC form says he's a 51% shareholder. Yeah. So now we tick all the boxes. We're an Indigenous business, and, that poor fella's nothing better than an ambassador collecting 5 or 10K a month while the whole business operates in the background like it always did when it was a non-Indigenous business. So I think until a couple of those blokes are called out and actually charged with fraudulently playing around with the system, I think we've got a long way to go to clean that up. Yeah. I think the Chambers of Commerce are doing a great job to clean that up. They're being a lot stricter and interviewing and digging deeper with who they're allowing to be a certified member. Yeah. That probably doesn't stick for some of the federal government sort of controlled certification processes, but I think that has to be cleaned up, and I'd actually like to see a couple of them be charged with fraudulently ripping the IPP system off. And I'm also a big believer. I think the government should announce an amnesty for these guys to bail out on some of these businesses, and I think you'd see them clear out like rats do. Especially if they knew that the penalties were serious, and there was some real deterrent in there, and I guess then it's about understanding, well, what role does an established business play in creating the business development for that Indigenous business to actually become a larger business in its own right? Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
And I think that then comes back to the whole capital discussion. You know, I think the big banks can probably be real drivers in this space and sit down with an Indigenous business and you know, co-invest with them on a loan.
Yeah.
And then say, look, we've done enough due diligence here. We know you don't have the security of mum's house, dad's house, your own house, or something like that to chuck in as equity. But we're going to give you, you know, this allotment of money to deliver that business plan, and we're going to work with you to get there. I know some of the banks offer dedicated business managers that work really closely with some of their bigger business partners.
Yeah.
And I think a system like that could really show what's there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is also a risk for the bank as well, that if the business plan's not adhered to and the partnership doesn't work, that they shouldn't then bury the Indigenous partner to chase their money either, because the ripple effect that has back through community is just people just won't try.
Yeah.
Because if they do have a few bucks in their pocket, they're not going to roll the dice to lose it.
Yeah. And in today's business world, it's a lot of businesses, major corporate businesses, have reconciliation plans, have Indigenous employment plans. I know that when I was with Coles, I was the ambassador for the Indigenous employment program. So I know that there's a lot of, once again, I'm going to use the word good intention, I guess, within that. But I guess we've got to move in many ways from the good intention into some practical applications to really support and drive the development in the Indigenous, and not just in Indigenous business itself, but within Indigenous business leaders. So that, you know, my forte is leadership development. So, you know, I love to see, you know, the diverse nature of our communities being replicated within leadership roles within, you know, corporate businesses. So I think that there's a fair bit that we can still be doing within that space, and we won't even get into the conversation about male and female leaders, you know, because that's another one altogether. So Adam, that's you've presented some really good practical advice today. So now I'm going to talk about you as a leader. And the first thing I'm going to ask is, do you actually see yourself as a leader?
To some degree, I do. I've become a little bit more comfortable with it as I've got older. But ultimately, I prefer to see myself as part of a wider team moving the needle forward versus, you know, sort of, hey, look, I'm over here, follow, come this way type thing. But it is something that that I suppose I'm starting to inherit a little more.
Yeah.
But on the same discussion of that, I also can't wait to hand it over to someone else either.
So who inspired you in your leadership journey or in your business journey?
I think there's some varied aspects to that. You know, I lived the dream as a kid that I was just going to play football. So, you know, funny, a kid from Western Sydney saw Wally Lewis as the bloke they wanted to be like. So probably why I've moved to Queensland now. But I wouldn't have got, you know, that's probably not something growing up I would have got away with out loud on a T-shirt or anything. No. But in a business sense, I think I probably found somebody that inspired me most from the leaders that I had and the bosses that I had that I didn't want to be. I think that actually formed me more than anything else. You know, and copped a fair different ones along the way, from, you know, the real dictatorship style to full-on micromanagement to, you know, even being told, you know, if you want to be promoted here, you're best not telling anybody you're Indigenous, just keep that under your hat, you know. So there's been a mixture of styles that I've seen come the way through, but I probably think one that stuck with me the most was a fellow called Paul Dobell in my role at Sanofi. He came from the paint industry to pharmaceutical, but the fact that he wasn't afraid to think differently, he wasn't afraid to challenge the people above him in the decision and the thinking, and he also had the interests of the whole team of paychecks at mind. He wasn't just interested in what the people that signed his paycheck or his promotion thought, and he actually didn't. I don't think he really cared. But what he did do was he was able to deliver the business growth. He was able to deliver growth in people. I think there's been a whole pile of people that were underneath him that have gone on to very good jobs and adopted a lot of his thinking behaviour. And I'm not even real sure he he leaves behind the impact. But I know he had an impact on my work ethic and the fact that I shouldn't be scared to, if I didn't believe what was being pitched in front, I shouldn't be frightened to say what I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about some of those traits of leadership there. You know, leaders are fundamentally here for their people. And, you know, it's interesting that your journey, that realization of leadership for yourself, is still firmly ensconced in that I'm here for my people, I'm here for my team, I'm here to be part of the wheels and the cogs of their journeys as well. And I think that if leaders can really take on the responsibility of developing their team to be the best that they can, and to allow them, you know, to stuff up every now and again, you know, take an idea, work with it, provide some guidance, I think that business overall is going to be in a much better space. So speaking about that, tell me about your relationship with failure. Because you obviously didn't become the next Wally Lewis. I might.
No, definitely not. No. So I was diagnosed with skin cancer, which ended any hope of fulfilling that sort of football space, and then sort of rebuilt the path from there and a bit of a change of direction from there. But, you know, I'm not, unfortunately, too friendly with failure. You know, I've had a business that went under and had to start again as a 30-year-old. And that actually taught me a lot more than the good parts of that. It taught me a real lesson in getting all the legals sorted before you make the money versus make the money and then you can sort that out later on. I've learnt the lesson of bad business partners as well, and they can do a lot more damage than not having them in at all. So, you know, just because you might need a little cash investment at the start, you know, the interest rate on a bad business partner with that money can cost you a fortune, if not the whole business.
Yeah.
When it goes bad. So I've also learnt the experience of having what's the exit plan. You know, we have a bank account at Supply Oz, quite crudely called the FU account. That's the day we all decide to say that. We split that and go home. So, and we have that chat often. Are we done with this? You know, what are we doing with it? Are we ending it? Are we keeping on going? And I think to have that chat, you're not forcing anybody along the journey either, because people have their own paths. And I think it's important to have a real exit strategy that's not the bank knocking at the door or a debt collector coming or you run out of money.
Yeah, and once again, just to support that, one of the key things I share with people that are coming to me to develop a business idea is that, as well as starting the business, they've got to be thinking about how they're going to end it, because, you know, the ultimate divestment is that we die and the business just dies with us. But what is that the preferred option, or do you want to actually build something of value so that you've actually got something to on-sell and move on to other things? So it's that's a good value. And it's interesting. Once again, you've learnt from people in leadership by looking at what you didn't want to be as a leader, and then you've learnt a lot from the failures that you've encountered along the way. So many people find failure and just frightening. For some people, thinking of failing is like fatal. But the reality is that there's always going to be something there that we can grab, no matter how bad, depressed, how much we've fallen flat on our face. There's always something there that we can take away that we can help rebuild ourselves. And I think that that's a really important message. So Adam, out of everything that you have accomplished, what are you most proud of?
Jeez. I think buying my first house, it's not something that a lot of my relatives can do. It's not something a lot of people in community can do. And it's something that, you know, we won't shake from. I think having that place where people and family and friends can feel safe at, I think is really important. And yeah, for me, that would be up there as one of the best achievements. Obviously, my wife and kids aren't here, otherwise I'd have to chuck them into the mix. But, you know, like from a personal standpoint, buying the house is definitely there, and probably seeing some of the rewards for working hard over a long period of time.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, your contribution to Supply Oz, but also, your own development, your own education is absolutely acknowledged from myself. So with that being said, talk about your vision going forward. So let's talk about not the FU account with Supply Oz. Talk about the vision for and what that looks like. And then I guess for the Indigenous space, where do you see from a visionary aspect Supply Oz and then the understanding or the development of the Indigenous business community?
I think for us now, for Supply Oz, we obviously have the PPE, which will do its bit, and the office supplies will do its bit, and we'll start to develop different parts in the office supplies more. So we have a program at the moment where we give kids in need that they might not be able to afford their back to school starter pack, where we send notes out to schools and they let us know, and we go pretty hard with our contracts to try and fund those. So we try and fund about 500 of those back to school packs each year.
Awesome.
And they're a non-branded pack. So we literally go to the school, and where does every kid get their stuff from? Oh, the local newsagent. Well, we'll just get that young primary school person one of those packs. So they go to school the same as every other kid. We don't feel there's a need to have them branded Supply Oz or Jingeri or anything like that. We just want it so it's the same as their peers in the classroom, so they can start that school year on the same page. And that includes a bit of uniform and, bag, pens, glue, tissues, whatever the case may be, that they can contribute and start the same and try and get that school part going. And then our medical business is really starting to evolve. So we have an exclusive deal with Samsung to bring a little ECG monitor, which will revolutionise the way, especially our people out in community and remote communities have their ECG monitoring done. It's a really tiny device. They can still walk and play in it, and it all gets sent data via the cloud. It can be interpreted by a cardiologist in the city and then corresponded back to their local AMS. So we're not making these people travel 2-3 days to have it done, and then it potentially fails. They've got to do it all over again. And encouraging them to keep the device so they can monitor their own health on their own phone, and they can start to become a little bit more aware of why monitoring your health is important. I think that's some of the next stage development in us as a business, and then as we sort of take the greater business forward to our ultimate goal of listing.
And once again, Adam, it's just compelling to me because, I asked the question about vision for Supply Oz, and understanding that link to community is just, that's your vision. It's whether it's getting kids into school with the right sort of back to school equipment that, that's within the community, and, the Samsung thing with your remote community. So if people listening to this can really, hopefully pick up that's the link. You're not sitting here saying, we want to be a $10 million business. I want to have a fleet of cars. You don't want 100 odd bodies. To what's coming across to me anyway is a very strong, clear link to how can we utilize this to give back to community. So I think that's absolutely fascinating. So within the Indigenous business space, where's that going to go? So over the next couple of years, what would you like to see?
I think, unfortunately, we're going to see a little retraction in the short term, which is just going to be the impacts of coming out of COVID, which is probably happening to a lot of businesses around the place. Before we see it truly mature and develop, I think there'll be a clean out in there as well, back into those sort of not quite rigid edge Indigenous businesses as well. I think we'll see a clean out of those, and that'll just come through education of procurement officers and the like, where they're starting to, get involved and really take a partnership approach with their Indigenous supplier. So then therefore they're like, hang on a minute, this doesn't really, this doesn't quite stack up, and I might have another look at another one, and I encourage that, and because I think those guys are even more key than policymakers. And at the same time, I think internally with our own business segment, we'll start to support our own businesses a little more and trust that we can do the right job as well. So that's sort of what I hope will happen in the short term anyway.
Excellent. Adam, it's been a very illuminating discussion with you today. Thank you so much for investing your time in developing not just the Indigenous leaders of today, but hopefully that whole concept of building tomorrow's best leaders today. So I really do thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Tony.